Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker and I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, how are you doing?
Hi, Michael. I feel like it's been a while since it's been us again. I've done a couple of hosting slots, but I'm glad it's back, the way it's meant to be.
This is Wednesday as they are supposed to be experienced here in the Novara Live studio. We've got some great stories for you tonight. We will be discussing violence against women and girls on public transport, which has seen reported instances up by 20% in the last year. The family of a British aid worker who was murdered in Gaza by the IDF are demanding the British government halt all arms sales to Israel, and more rioters in England have been sentenced. For many of us in the UK, the hot weather of the last few days has been a welcome break from an otherwise grim summer, but it goes without saying, warm weather isn't always good news. According to new analysis from The Guardian, since the beginning of this year, an unprecedented number of heat records have been broken around the world. The paper reports that 2024 has so far seen 15 all-time national heat records fall and a further 130 national monthly records broken. There have also been tens of thousands of local records smashed in places as far afield as Antarctica and the South Pacific. And according to data from the EU's climate monitoring Copernicus satellite, the 22nd of July this year was the hottest day in the Earth's recorded history. Maximiliano Herrera is a climate historian who maintains an archive of extreme weather events. He told The Guardian this amount of extreme heat events is beyond anything ever seen or ever thought possible before. The months from February 2024 to July 2024 have been the most record-breaking for every statistic. The data is especially worrying given that there has been a fading El Niño effect this year. So last year's record temperatures were attributed to the combination of man-made global heating and the warming of the Pacific Ocean by the naturally occurring El Niño phenomenon. But that effect has been dissipating since February and should have brought lower temperatures. Instead, they've been continuing to rise. And that trajectory is set to stay, according to Copernicus director Carlo Buontempo. He told The Guardian this. Even if this specific streak of extremes ends at some point, we are bound to see new records being broken as the climate continues to warm. This is inevitable unless we stop adding greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and the oceans. Most of the national records that have been broken come from countries in the tropics. Costa Rica broke its national record twice in 1 month, recording a high of 41 degrees Celsius on March the 6th, and then an even higher temperature of 41.5 degrees 2 weeks later. And Mexico and Egypt both recorded all-time highs of over 50 degrees. But the increasing heat has knock-on effects for other weather phenomena as well. They're being felt elsewhere too. Just this month, Japan saw several tropical storms hit the country in quick succession following heat waves and drought. The storms caused record-breaking rainfall and flooding, as well as widespread damage. In the South Indian province of Kerala, over 350 people are thought to have been killed by landslides caused by record-breaking rainfall. Scientists in India have blamed climate change for the 10% increase in rainfall that led to the flooding last month. There has also been record-breaking, or at least very extreme, wildfires in Greece, triggered by 40-degree temperatures and low rainfall, which has consumed more than 40 square miles of forest land in the northeast of Athens. This is from NBC.
In the suburbs of Athens, people are fleeing for their lives, evacuating by the hundreds from hospitals and homes and monasteries, leaving however they can. As a brutal heat wave whips up Greece's worst wildfire so far this year, blanketing the Greek capital with thick smoke, torching everything in its path, and turning the sky into an ominous shade of red. Authorities calling this fire exceptionally dangerous, with flames more than 80 feet high. The wind would go in one direction, then the other, this North Athens man says. The smoke was suffocating. You couldn't see. Your eyes teared up. You couldn't breathe. Greece declaring an all-out war on this blaze. 700 firefighters, 190 fire engines, and dozens of planes and helicopters working around the clock as residents take matters into their own hands, putting out flames however they can.
I'm joined now by Chloe Brimicombe, a heatwave scientist at the Wegener Center, University of Graz in Austria. Thank you so much for joining us. We talked a lot about sort of heat records being broken last year, and when sort of I talked to my expert climate guests, they'd always give the same answer. I mean, obviously, with interesting differences, but sort of the fundamentals would be there's El Nino going on, which is this naturally occurring phenomenon which happens every 3 years or so, which does lead to higher temperatures, plus climate change. And those two facts were why we got so many record-breaking days last year. We were expecting, with El Nino fading, to see some lower temperatures this year, but that doesn't seem to be happening. Is that correct? And how worrying is that?
So, yeah, you're right to say that El Nino causes background warming. And we did think that perhaps it would be faster in sort of wearing off in a way. But we do know that with El Nino, it's what is called teleconnections. So it's an atmospheric ocean oscillation, which occurs in the Pacific. But then it actually is known to cause warming globally, and then also it affects weather events globally. So if you think of the world and waves and how the whole atmosphere sort of works, it takes a very long time for the effect of El Nino to wear off, even if we're not experiencing El Nino patterns where it occurs in the Pacific. So basically what we saw this year was climate change and then this added impact of El Nino. And although it wasn't then occurring in the Pacific anymore, we just basically saw that effect also wearing off. And we don't fully understand sort of the dynamics yet between El Nino and also climate change. So there is some evidence maybe that period of, I think it's 3 to 7 years, like what is that like pattern between climate change and El Nino, and also other ones so we also have the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is in the Northern Atlantic, and that's what causes sort of a rise in whether you would have more storms in the winter in the UK, for example. So there's other ones that also occur as well as El Nino, but that's the one is most well known, especially because of the relationship between these record-breaking temperatures and its occurrence.
Okay, that's interesting. So we are still seeing the effects of El Nino. It's not as if El Nino's gone and the high temperatures are still here, and so it wasn't really about El Nino. It was always just about climate change. That's, in an odd way, somewhat reassuring, I suppose. And I assume that means that as it wears off, maybe we won't have so many record-breaking temperatures next year. And if we did, that would be incredibly worrying. Let's talk about what kind of places are most affected by record-breaking heat waves. Is it mainly sort of in built-up city areas? I'm sort of when I imagine heat waves and sort of the effects of climate change, I always think of people in cities. Is that correct?
So heat waves is actually quite interesting because we've seen from scientific reports that everywhere globally is at risk of a heat wave. It's just sort of by chance that some places haven't had these massive record-breaking ones as of yet. Cities are regions that are more at risk of heat waves because it's hotter in a city because of the environment you're surrounded by. So you're surrounded by concrete and impermeable structures, which then radiate heat more, and so it's hotter there. And also, it's also hotter at night often in a city because the heat is trapped and then released back by these environments in the nighttime. So that is why you would see cities being sort of mentioned more often. But also people that are very isolated. So if you're like in the middle of Australia, for example, in some of the very isolated desert regions, they've been found to be at more risk of heat waves as well, just because they don't have the ability to, ask for help from others. And often also in regions where there's less water or water scarcity, that's one of the main ways you cool down during a heat wave. So they would also be more at risk. But it's definitely something that we do see being associated with cities, but also because a lot of people in trends are moving to cities. And so basically climate change is thought to be a growing threat to cities because of the migration of people there as well. So you have a lot of dense population, and then like if you have a heat wave or a flood, a lot more people are affected in a short period than if people were over like a wider area almost.
I suppose rising temperatures, again, it seems sort of natural to think this is going to be the biggest problem in countries which are already quite warm. So obviously, if we have record-breaking temperatures and they're sort of 41 degrees, which everyone was shocked that happened in the UK. But obviously in Egypt, as we've just heard, their record-breaking temperatures are over 50 degrees. So is it sort of those countries close to the equator that are going to feel the more catastrophic effects of increased heat sooner than the rest of the world?
So the difference between those countries and countries like the UK is, so first of all, a heat wave is different in the UK as it is to Egypt. So the temperature you'd be looking at in Egypt is in the late 30s, early 40s, 50s is really record breaking for that country. Whereas in the UK, you're looking at late 20s, early 30s, just because of what we're used to in terms of climate. Because of course, like the UK is a temperate climate zone, so it's a lot colder here most of the year than Egypt is. The difference is that the countries close to the equator, especially sort of places like Iraq and Pakistan, and India as well, what we're thinking is with projections, they could reach a limit where it's basically unlivable. So there's this limit in terms of heat, which is 35 degrees Celsius with 100% humidity. And that's the limit within a range. There's a range depending on like if you're healthy, your age, whether you just actually are really good at dealing with heat. But once that's reached, if you don't have access to cooling for, it's about 6 or more hours after that, even healthy people will start to die. And we're not seeing that limit like breached for enough hours yet, but we are already seeing like this change to air conditioning culture. So in countries like Qatar and also the United Arab Emirates, there's a lot of like, you'll see people moving between air conditioned spaces. And so that actually changes the whole way a society works. And so that's kind of the challenges that are faced in those countries in comparison to sort of rising mortality and how we deal with changing the way we build to like a warmer environment in parts of Northern and Western Europe. So it's quite different challenges for the same weather phenomenon, actually.
And so let's end by talking about air conditioning. I always hear sort of people arguing about it on Twitter, people saying air conditioning only makes a problem worse, and people saying we definitely need air conditioning. I mean, as you said sort of there, the Gulf countries, they've resolved this problem by they have loads of air conditioning, so people are moving from one aircon building to another. Do we essentially need there to be quite a lot more air conditioning in cities around the world? And I suppose at least, one place that people can gather if you get this sort of incredible heat that you're talking about, where you've also got high humidity, which is just simply unlivable.
I've also seen the battles on Twitter about air conditioning. The problem with air conditioning is that it causes this feedback. And actually, I just saw a really recent study that showed that during extreme heatwave events, you also see a rise in carbon emissions that's going to cause a rise in number of heatwave events. So that's kind of the drawback from air conditioning. The problem is that we do need air conditioning for places where vulnerable people to heat actually are. So like that, maybe that's schools, maybe that's hospitals, maybe that's care homes. Possibly in a lot of regions, I'm not sure the UK necessarily needs mass investment in air conditioning. I think it's more like targeting it towards the people that need it. And unfortunately, what you will see, and this is kind of the concern, is that there's a worry that the people that are causing most rise in carbon emissions currently have the most ability to actually invest in air conditioning, and therefore they will then continue to have like this inequality on the people that would actually need air conditioning and are vulnerable to heat. So like the lower economic groups and those with pre-existing medical conditions, elderly and children and infants. So really we need probably even thinking about like a plan. There's like this UN guidelines on heat, but maybe countries need to think about planning on more legislation around air conditioning. Also, because in a lot of countries, I think people are using very old air conditioning units. And there's newer technology that causes less emissions. So maybe there needs to be more bans, because there is in some countries like Ghana, maybe there needs to be bans on like the emissions that an air conditioning unit could actually produce, and how much they need to be serviced and all of this. So that's definitely an area that could be really interesting and is upcoming kind of in this field. which is quite exciting to see. And we can see new technologies and all of this, which is actually really interesting.
That's a great professional industry for maybe our viewers to go into, air conditioning. Chloe Brimicombe, thank you so much for joining us this evening. The sentencing of the far-right rioters in Britain is exceptionally performative. Those who took part in the racist disorder that terrorised this country are receiving a form of expedited justice with tougher-than-usual sentences, and it's all being done in the public view. To any right-wingers watching, no, this is not a sign of two-tier policing based on politics. It's exactly what happened after the 2011 riots as well. The state doesn't like riots, so it makes an example of rioters. And the latest man to be made an example of is 51-year-old John Cann from Plymouth. Cann had been seen on police video footage at unrest in the city. Cameras captured him first bending down and picking up an item and throwing it at the counter-protesters. He was then shown later picking up a firework and hurling it just before it went off. He's been given a 3-year sentence. What's remarkable about this case, though, is not the crime in question or the punishment delivered, but the comments made by the judge during the sentencing. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Robert Linford noted that according to Cann's police interview, he discussed with them, quote, the better use of taxpayers' money and why people were having to pay to keep these people, migrants, in this country after committing such heinous crimes. So this guy told the police, all this taxpayer money is going to migrants. Judge Linford, delivering this sentence, then said this. So let's look at how the taxpayer have been funding your activities over the last 38 years. Let's see what you've cost the country. You've got 10 aliases, 4 fictitious birth dates, you're 51 years of age, you've been convicted of 170 offences, you've been convicted of theft, arson, taking cars, handling stolen goods, obtaining by deception, burglary, dangerous driving, and possessing bladed articles. In all, over the years that you've been visiting the criminal justice system, you've received sentences totaling 357 months in prison, many of them concurrent. In other words, nearly 30 years. That, Mr. McCann, is what you've been costing this country, and you sit there in that interview and saw fit to be critical of others. You have no right, whatever, to say who should or should not be in this country. So he's saying, you're saying migrants cost the taxpayer money. You, with this life of crime, you've actually cost the British people much more money than any migrant, right? This response has gone viral on social media and won Judge Linford lots of plaudits. It also sparked a bit of a policy debate about why this man was out on the streets in the first place, given the number of prior convictions he had. So John Byrne-Murdoch is the chief data reporter for the Financial Times. He said this: people are right when they say the last government's failed policy led to the riots. It just turns out the failed policy wasn't the one everyone has been talking about. It was failing to build enough prisons and thus letting people with 170 previous convictions roam the streets. Now, as you'll maybe know from previous shows, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that view. And we discussed ideas like this on the show, indeed debated them. But I looked into this case and it's not actually that simple. Right, so this is from the Plymouth Herald. In mitigation, Bailey and Cann, so Bailey's another guy, but Cann's advocate, Felines Grosvenor, said Cann had a history of largely non-violent offences. He insisted he had no alignment with the far right, did not hide his face, and was disgusted with himself, was sorry and had written a letter to police to apologise. He claimed he was injured while having a peaceful discussion with an officer and police helped him up when he fell and hit his head. She noted that he had diagnoses for PTSD and anxiety, suffered a deprived upbringing, was placed in care since the age of 6 years old, and in 1992 fell 95 feet and severely damaged his leg, resulting in him being in a coma for a short while and the requirement of a prosthetic leg since 2010. She noted that he was also a heroin user, but had been clean for 3.5 years. Dalia, I want your thoughts on this. In fact, this was a sort of a topic that me and you were debating, sort of how long people should go to jail for. This story, it's just kind of tragic all round, isn't it? This guy has clearly caused a lot of people a lot of problems over the years. Clearly, he hasn't had the best of lives either. How do you respond to this situation?
Yeah, this is quite a typical story. Someone with 170 convictions is not normally someone who is doing well. That's kind of how a lot of these things go. And that's why, in my personal view, putting them in prison and, will ultimately make a lot of those problems worse. It will deepen the material problems. It will likely deepen mental health issues. It's not a place where people get better. But I think for me as well, what's sort of more tragic about this entire situation is the fact that it's so insufficient. And I don't say that as a way of saying, oh, these sentences aren't sufficient or that people should be going down for longer. But rather, it's that to go after these rioters, to throw the book at these rioters, right, is kind of the lowest hanging fruit. I don't feel necessarily safer as someone who is both a person of color, but more importantly, who is honestly terrified for the safety of refugees and asylum seekers in this country. I don't go to sleep safer today than I did the day before the riots, because ultimately, for a lot of these rioters and for a lot of people who are engaged in this kind of politics, they have been getting these calls from the very top. Now, sure, Nigel Farage, Rupert Murdoch, David Cameron, Theresa May, even Keir Starmer, they never at any point said, go out and riot. But when you have people whose material conditions are declining in very steep ways, in ways that are very scary, in ways that are like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to consistently put a roof over my head. I'm unwell, or a family member is unwell. I don't know if they're going to be able to get healthcare. When you have a population like that, the message to the white people in that population, even though we've all been going through this decline in living standards, but the message that is being radiated to the white people in that society from people who are meant to be trusted, journalists, politicians, these are meant to be trusted sources of information. Despite the consistent evidence against this fact, they have been told that the reason that you are fearing for you and your family and your community's lives and well-being is because of the presence of people of color, asylum seekers, migrants, who are not only taking resources out of your mouth and resources off your plate, but are active violent threats. They're stabbing people, they're grooming your daughters. This hysteria, this moral panic that has been that people have been indoctrinated by, it was only a matter of time before that was going to translate into people taking to the streets, into people doing something with that politics that they have been indoctrinated with. But also, I think it's very naive to say that this is the scenes that we're seeing are directly relatable to one particular policy. Certainly, I don't think it's anything to do with not building enough prisons. I also don't even think you can just say it's the fault of austerity. Rather, it's very much in the historical DNA of this country as a country that relies on labor from racialized people, both internally, we rely on migrant labor inside the country. We also rely on migrant labor and migrant resources, racialized labor and racialized resources abroad. And yet this country defines itself against those very racialized others. The first race riot in this country happened in 1919. It has been a consistent feature of this country's politics, from the 60s, the 70s and the 80s. It has been very much part of the underlying foundation of our country that surfaces during moments of economic decline. And so the fact that those long-term conditions are not being addressed, but even the short-term ones of the way that our politicians and our media speak about refugees and asylum seekers, no accountability has been taken there. The fact that, a couple of hundred people are going down for 20 months or going down for several years into an institution that is only likely to make them more dispossessed, more violent, and have even less to lose, doesn't make me, or I'm sure many other people in this country, necessarily feel in the long term safer.
I mean, I suppose the argument for giving long sentences is to deter people doing other riots. It's not going to deter them from being racist, but I suppose it potentially is sort of arresting people quickly and then doing this expedited justice did have some role in ending the riots earlier than they otherwise would have done. But I do take many of your points, although I'd say I think journalists and politicians are the least trusted groups of people in the country. So we're included in that, unfortunately. Let's talk about another sentence that was handed out today in Plymouth. This one is pretty wild, I think. So this is from ITV. Amma Walid, 24, of Central Park Towers, who was a counter-protester, was sentenced to 20 months behind bars. Walid was seen throwing cans on 4 occasions back at the far-right side of the protest. His defense said he went not expecting violence, but solidarity with his community. He claimed he reacted after a bottle or can of alcohol was thrown at him. He said he doesn't drink and was offended by this and became angry, throwing other missiles at opposing protesters. The court was told he shouted Allahu Akbar in support of his religion against the racist slurs being chanted by the other side. Walid could be seen surrounded by placards saying love, not hate. Sentencing Walid, Judge Limford accepted he had not entered the city looking for trouble and that protesters had been throwing missiles and making deeply offensive racist chants. He said, "What you should have done was rise above their simply obnoxious racism. You were capable of doing that, but you didn't. Instead, what you did was throw 4 missiles of one sort or another at the group opposite. All of the defendants except Walid had previous convictions recorded against them." So this guy, this 24-year-old, had no previous convictions. So the 3 people, so one of them we just sort of described earlier in this segment, had many previous convictions. This guy didn't. And this does seem shocking to me. Right? So with a fella, such as John Cann, who we were talking about before, I think it's a complex situation because obviously, he's had a very difficult life. I don't want to see him punished for the sake of being punished, but I think it is probably important to deter people not to attend far-right riots and throw stuff. And I think he does seem like a bit of a danger to society, so sort of taking him off the streets for a while is probably helpful. You've got to weigh against that, sort of what trauma he might experience in prison, but clearly there's a case to put him away, right? A strong case to put him away, I would say. This guy, no prior convictions. So there's no evidence that this is the kind of person who is a danger to anyone. The judge accepts he didn't go looking for a fight, right? He didn't turn up to a far-right riot. He turned up to a counter-protester. And at that counter-protest, he threw back some cans. Like if he'd picked up, a brick and thrown it at the fascists, fine. That is quite a dangerous thing to do. You might say you can understand why he'd throw a brick at a fascist, but it's clearly, very much legal. But throwing a few cans back at far-right protesters when you've got 0 prior convictions and then getting 20 months in jail. I mean, he'll only serve 40% of that probably. So he'll serve about 8 months in jail and then be on remand for the rest of it. But still, that's going to be on your record, and that, putting him away just seems like a completely crazy decision. To me, Dalia, it seems as if the government, the courts, everyone's a bit spooked by this claim of 2-tier policing from the likes of Nigel Farage, and they're sort of overcompensating by putting people away who really definitely shouldn't be put away.
And this is the problem, is that our politicians, our media are actually very scared to contradict the far right. They actually feel much more comfortable conceding to the talking points of the far right because they're afraid to tell the truth, which is that we know that 2-tier policing is a myth when it comes to this idea that racialized people, I can't even believe that I'm saying it, that there are people who believe that Black and brown people in this country are policed more softly than white people. It's absolute, there's not show me a single statistic, a single piece of evidence that demonstrates that that is the reality. And what I think is obviously this is absolutely disgraceful. The idea, I see people throw cans of beer or cans at concerts. I see people throw cans at football matches. You cannot tell me that every far-right rioter that threw a can at someone went down for 20 months. And let's not forget, it's not just about the 8 months he's spending in prison. It's about the knock-on effects of this young man's life, that he was in a position where racists were threatening to come and attack his community. And he acted in a way that maybe this judge, I don't know if that judge has ever been in such a position, that judge feels like he should have had a morally superior high ground or whatever. It's so out of touch. It's so damaging. It's so cruel. But also it just, one thing, again, with this 2-tier policing, one thing that on the left, many, especially prison abolitionists say, and I have a lot of sympathy for this position, is this idea that when we see these kinds of harsh policing, instances of policing of the far right, we should not support these expanded or these kind of legal precedents, because these are things that are always going to get used against racialized people and against leftists. Now, I agree with that broadly, but I think that it's in the wrong order. And actually what we are seeing is that the kinds of policing that people of color have been subject to historically in this country has now, in a moment of exception, been applied to white people. You know, when we think about, for example, the Manchester 10, that was an example of, several young Black boys being sentenced to years in prison, some as high as 8 years in prison, for sending WhatsApp messages, for exchanging drill songs on WhatsApp. This kind of like harsh policing, we saw with the emoji trials. Luckily, they were found not guilty, but still, people of color finding themselves in front of the docks for posting an emoji. These kinds of expansions of what is considered to be threatening criminal activity, and people getting these very extreme sentences, and these categories like gangs and terrorism and these ever expanding things being used as reasons to buck legal precedents. That is something that people of color have always been experiencing. And now we have this one moment where it's being applied to a different part of society. And the worry is not so much that, now they're going to start doing this against people of color and leftists, because they've always been doing it against us, but rather that this kind of moment of exception is going to be used to justify or imply or suggest that these expansions of police powers are not racist police powers, because look, we applied them to white people when white people were tearing up the streets, when actually that is the exception that proves the rule. This is the real face of harsh policing in this country is not what we are seeing now. What we are seeing now is simply what has been part of our system for a really long time, just being applied to a group of people that are typically protected from that kind of harsh policing.
The number of reported violent attacks against women and girls on Britain's railways has increased by more than 20% in a year. More than 11,000 complaints were made in the year to March, compared with 9,500 complaints the previous year. The British Transport Police put the rise down to an increase in the number of women who report such crimes, as opposed to an increase in the amount of gender-based crime itself. But with 31 violent crimes against women and girls being reported every day on public transport, this is clearly an acute problem. I'm joined now by Hera Hussain, the founder of Chain. That's an international organisation fighting against gender-based violence. Hera, we've seen this data. Do we have an idea whether this is about more people reporting or more crime? And I suppose, how would we know if crime is getting better or worse?
It's always hard to say, because when you're looking at reported data, it's already a subsection of what the total crime would be, especially around something like gender-based violence. There are so many reasons why survivors don't come forward. We do have some other evidence from Plan International, for instance, who looked at young women in the UK, and they found that 97% had experienced sexual harassment in the public space. So not just from trains or public transport, but just in public spaces, of which public transport will be one of them. So I think there is multiple reports of that. I personally don't think that it's easy to decipher whether it's just more crime happening or whether it's more report. In any case, we know the number of women are reporting is increasing. So that means some of the messaging work that's happened before from different organizations, including the transport companies and authorities, around reporting this, making sure that everybody knows that harassment on travel and transit is not okay, has worked.
What kind of harassment are we looking at? What abuses are we talking about that seem to be taking place on public transport? I know they said there's sort of 31 people a day making complaints. What kind of crimes or abuses are being reported?
It's leering, staring, catcalling, also called eve teasing. It's inappropriate touching, indecent exposure, upskirting, people physically touching someone, and then sexual assault. So these are like some of the sort of most common ones.
And I know that you yourself have suffered sexual harassment on a train, on public transport, and you reported it. Could you sort of talk about that experience?
Yes, I mean, I've faced countless have had countless experiences of sexual harassment on public transport. I did have only reported once, and that was when a few years ago when I was going from London to Glasgow to see my parents, and it was the last train of the day, so it was very late when we were coming near Glasgow. The train was almost empty, and someone got on a couple of stations before Glasgow, and he was very drunk, and he chose to sit in front of me and reached over to kind of touch my chest and was making small talk, generally mumbling and not really conscious. So I felt pretty afraid, especially because a bunch of young girls had entered the train. And I felt like it was my responsibility to do something, because he then got off the table I was at and then went nearer them. So I got in touch with the train manager. He immediately took action. When we arrived in Glasgow, the police was waiting. They took him away and took a statement from me. And that process went, they were supportive in that process. And then for a year, I was just kind of waiting to hear back from them. They called me a couple of times telling me that they were looking at CCTV footage. CPS had chosen to take the case forward. So a year later, I was asked to go to Glasgow. So I flew to Glasgow to sort of give evidence in court. And then I waited in the waiting room for a few hours. And then CPS decided to drop the case because there was not enough evidence, they said, despite CCTV footage. And he was not really conscious. He doesn't even remember it. So it just felt like a waste of time and energy on everyone's part, including public resources of having it dragged out like that. But far worse things have happened to me on public transport, but I chose to report that specific one.
And I suppose from that story you've just told, from that account you've just given, it seems like it puts you in potentially a difficult situation, because you work for a sort of a charity that's campaigning against gender-based violence. I assume you'd encourage people to report gender-based violence they experience on public transport. Yet it seems like, the process you went through was deeply unsatisfactory. I mean, what do you advise people in a situation such as that to do?
We always say that if the choice to report or not report is definitely up to the person who's experienced that violence. There's, reporting is good, but with reporting, we have to think about what is the purpose of reporting. If the purpose of reporting is that I just want this to be recorded, that this is happening, so people know, and I'm putting this kind of so people are bearing witness to this kind of crime, that better planning is being put in place by the authorities, and that other survivors know that they're not alone, then I think reporting is a great thing. If we are viewing reporting only from the lens of someone needs to be held accountable for it, then it's not a useful thing. And that's why we don't encourage or discourage people to report for that reason. There should be lots of different ways of holding someone accountable, depending on the kind of sexual harassment that's happened. In my case, I really just wanted an apology. He didn't even remember what had happened. So I feel like there was no benefit of dragging him and me for a year in this process. And really, if they could have facilitated a face-to-face conversation where he could have realized the impact of what he did, and also I can see that he, is taking some accountability for it, that would have been a satisfactory outcome. But in other cases where you have sexual assault, indecent exposure, you have unwanted touching, and just really escalating crimes like that, more will need to be done. So I think this is only viewing this from one lens of dragging people to the court, throwing them in jail. This is not very helpful.
What kind of strategies would you be proposing to try and stop this or limit this?
Firstly, we need to think about why is it happening. So we need more education and sort of preventative work around sort of undoing misogyny and this acceptance of women's bodies as public properties and men's entitlement over it. So I think a lot of education piece needs to be done around that, so boys don't grow up feeling entitled over it. But like I said, in my case, I would have wanted a more sort of restorative process where I want the abuser to understand the impact of his actions. That's what I needed from that process. But in other cases, some survivors will want to see someone's day in court and someone being taken away. And that's fine. I think we need to have those different avenues. The British Transport Police are talking about having a campaign that's around sexual harassment on trains. And I think it's a really good idea to think about bystanders. 51% of women in this report said that someone had intervened on their behalf. In my experience, like I would say 90% of the time, nothing happens. People pretend they haven't seen, they don't do anything, they avoid looking at you. Women will like look at you supportively, and then, women are just expected to kind of deal with it. So you get off a stop early, you move places. There's so much that bystanders can do and really be allies, whether it is offering your seat, helping create distance between what's happening, go and getting the train manager, getting ground staff to do something about it, or just call if they feel brave enough and they feel safe enough, then calling that person out. And for others who are seeing someone being called out to also join in and support the first brave voice. So there are lots of things that bystanders can do. And I think that's a critical piece of all this discussion that needs to be taken forward.
Israel's genocidal onslaught in Gaza is now in its 11th month. In that time, nearly 40,000 Palestinians have been killed by the IDF's bombs and guns. 17,000 of those were children. And now, for the first time, we have figures revealing how Israeli violence has impacted the very youngest Palestinians. According to human rights organisation Euromed Monitor, Israel has so far killed 2,100 infants and toddlers in Gaza. The Euromed Monitor report says this: the number of Palestinian children, whether infants or children in general, killed by the Israeli army is horrifying, and the rate of their killing is unprecedented in the history of modern wars. It also represents a dangerous trend based on the dehumanization of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Israel's military targets Palestinians and their children daily, methodically, and widely in the most heinous and brutal ways possible, and virtually without pause for 10 consecutive months. Due to the Israeli bombing of homes, buildings, residential neighborhoods, shelter centers, and displacement tents, many children have lost their heads and limbs. This is a flagrant violation of the rules of distinction, proportionality, military necessity, i.e., the legal and moral obligation to take the necessary precautions to minimize the deaths of civilians and children. Those figures and description of the injuries inflicted on the smallest of children are horrifying, and they aren't just abstract cases. Twin brother and sister Aysal and Assa were born on Saturday in Deir al-Balah, that's in central Gaza. On Tuesday, their father, Mohammed Abu al-Qumsan, left their home to go and register their births. While at the registry office, he got a phone call from neighbors telling him to come home. The building they were living in had been destroyed in an Israeli strike. Still clutching the newly laminated birth certificates, Mohammed said, quote, "My wife is gone, my 2 babies, and my mother-in-law. I was told it's a tank shell on the apartment they were in a house we were displaced to." The Euromed Monitor report on child killings in Gaza makes a direct connection to the dehumanization of Palestinians, not only by Israelis, but by the Western world. The killing of over 2,000 Palestinian babies and toddlers in just 10 months just doesn't seem to matter, nor apparently does the IDF's systematic use of civilians in Gaza as human shields. Israeli newspaper Haaretz has revealed how IDF soldiers use Palestinians to inspect potentially booby-trapped tunnels in Gaza. The Haaretz investigation follows an earlier report by Al Jazeera on the IDF's practice of using Palestinians as human shields. Footage obtained by the network shows a Palestinian man dressed in IDF uniform forced to enter a tunnel tied to a rope and with a camera strapped to his shoulder. It appears that he's being sent ahead to act as a shield against surprise attacks or booby traps. Haaretz has now revealed that the practice is widespread, saying this: they're usually wearing Israeli army uniforms. Many of them are in their 20s, and they're always with Israeli soldiers of various ranks. But if you look more closely, you see that most of them are wearing sneakers, not army boots, and their hands are cuffed behind their backs, and their faces are full of fear. The soldiers call each of them a shawish, an obscure Arabic word of Turkish origin meaning sergeant. Our lives are more important than their lives, soldiers were told. The thinking is that it's better for the Israeli soldiers to remain alive and for the shawishim to be the ones blown up by an explosive device. One IDF soldier told Haaretz this: about 5 months ago, 2 Palestinians were brought to us. One was 20, the other was 16. We were told, use them, they're Gazans, use them as human shields. Another IDF soldier told Haaretz what happened when objections were raised to a senior officer about the practice. One of the commanders turned to one of the combat soldiers who tried to receive answers and told him, You don't agree that the lives of your friends are much more important than their lives? And isn't it better that our friends will live and not be blown up by an explosive device, and that they get blown up by an explosive device? The use of either civilians or captured enemy combatants as human shields is a war crime. Not that that seems to matter much to IDF commanders, with Haaretz reporting this about a case involving a teenage Palestinian captured by the Israeli military. After 2 or 3 days in which a teenager was used as a human shield by soldiers, they asked to speak with the battalion commander and told him they no longer wished to take part. This is soldiers saying this. Some also raised doubts about another issue, the need for the order to burn buildings after the buildings were searched. The term international law came up a number of times, but the battalion commander reportedly had one response to all the soldiers' questions. A soldier doesn't need to take an interest in the laws of war. You need to think about the IDF's values and act according to the IDF's values, not the laws of war. The IDF's values appear to be blowing up babies and coercing terrified Palestinian civilians to fight their war for them. Dalia, incredibly shocking story here, and incredibly shocking data from Euromed Monitor. I mean, what can we say about this?
I mean, just when I think I can't be shocked and disgusted anymore, particularly as a British citizen, a British taxpayer whose money and political cover is enabling and facilitating this blind murder of a society. Just when I think I can't be any more shocked or disgusted, I think I've literally seen it all. The IDF and Israel find a way to surpass my expectations. There's a lot of very rich text in there, actually, taking the quotes from IDF commanders saying you obey the values of the IDF, not the values of war or international law, sorry. And I mean, what gets me is how upfront Israel has been about so much of what they're doing, because ultimately the values of the IDF, it's becoming apparent, is to break the back of Palestinian society. It is to make Gaza entirely uninhabitable and no longer viable as Palestinian land, as Palestinian society. They've said as much. And I think for me, especially as I said, as someone who's via the tax that I pay to my government and the political cover and the political legitimacy that my government gives, that I have this complicity in what is happening, there is this real sense of what more do the Palestinians have to do? Like, how much more do they have to show us? How much more innocent and vulnerable do they have to display themselves as being? I mean, we're talking about newborn babies whose births had not even been registered yet. We're talking about babies in intensive care. Even if that is the logic that you're going by, that war happens and things happen in war and how much brutality and completely gratuitous brutality does not only the Palestinians have to show us, but do Israeli figures have to admit to for our government to actually pull the plug on this? Because Britain, Europe, the US have the power to pull this plug. And every day that they do not pull the plug is an active choice to continue the slaughter of Palestinian society, not just in Gaza, not just in the West Bank, but Palestinians all over the world who are deeply wounded and broken by what we are seeing unfold. And this question of, how visible this genocide has been, how visible this, how meticulously archived and documented. We always think, when we think about historic atrocities, it can always be a slight comfort to think, oh, well, most ordinary people didn't really know or didn't really understand what was going on, but if you knew and if you understood, and once society did know and did understand and were informed, that they stood up and things changed. We don't have that plausible deniability in this historical moment. We do not have the plausible deniability. Our government does not have the plausible deniability to say, we did not know what was happening. The Palestinians have shown us, they have documented it in granular detail. And even Israelis, even Israeli government officials, Israeli military officials have all but confessed and boasted about the logic and the depths of destruction that they want to see in Gaza. And so this question of what do we do next and the loss of that is so difficult to reckon with. And what I was thinking of when I'm thinking about the amount of spectacle that we've seen, the amount of images and visuals and stories that we've seen. There's this Twitter page that I'm sure many of our audience will be familiar with. It's called Martyrs of Gaza. And the aim of this Twitter page is to basically, when someone is martyred in Gaza, to kind of make them more than a number and to sort of tell their life story, right? It's this idea of like trying to humanize so that people will be activated into action, so that people will not tolerate this. And just yesterday, this Twitter account, which has 150,000 followers, said, "This will be the last post we share here. We believe there is no point in telling our human stories anymore. Everyone has grown accustomed to seeing us killed. It's no longer worth the risk to send our voice out to a world that is content with mere solidarity. Even many of our human stories no longer interest people. Even our voice is being ignored." And that to me really speaks to this idea of, if our world and if our society and if all of these measures and institutions that we're meant to have in place to stop these kinds of atrocities happening, if it can show itself to be so defanged in this moment, then truly none of us are safe. If we can know as much as we know and yet still be sending out parts of fighter jets to conduct this violence and call ourselves a rules-based country or rules-based world, truly none of us are safe in this world. And Gaza is merely a portal into the world that has always existed, maybe, but certainly does exist now, because it's coming up to a year now and Israel have gotten away with it, with literal murder in plain sight.
Let's talk about the people resisting this, or some of the people resisting this, because despite 10 months' worth of evidence of Israeli brutality, war crimes, and even genocidal acts, Western governments are sticking by the rogue state. But ordinary people are applying pressure to the governments and corporations supporting the carnage in Gaza. They include the family of a murdered British aid worker who have called on British Foreign Secretary David Lammy to end all arms sales to Israel. That's according to Declassified UK. 33-year-old former Royal Marine James Henderson was killed in Gaza in April when an Israeli drone strike targeted the World Kitchen convoy he and 6 other humanitarian aid workers were travelling in, killing all of them. Despite public calls by then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak for a transparent investigation into the killings, no report has ever been made public. Ultimately, 2 IDF officers were fired for what Israel called, quote, a grave mistake. In a letter to David Lammy from their lawyer, the family have demanded full and total transparency over the killing of the workers, as well as assurance that no British parts were used in the drones responsible for the attack. The government has so far refused to rule out the possibility that British-made components were involved. They've also called on the government to release RAF spy footage taken on the day of the massacre and demanded that, quote, no further weapons whatsoever will be provided by the UK government to Israel. So in their letter, the parents say that they are, quote, deeply concerned that history will show that Britain, the country they love, was complicit with Israeli genocide, illegality, and failures to meet international obligations. Labour are expected to announce soon whether an internal review has recommended that arms sales to Israel should be suspended. Meanwhile, in the United States, a top executive appears to have lost his job over a global boycott linked to Israel. Starbucks has sacked its chief executive after a boycott of its coffee chain over its support for Israel led to a global sales slump. That downturn has been fairly dramatic, actually. Starbucks has seen a trend towards slowing sales over the last 3 years, but always while still growing. But following October the 7th, sales began to contract and have been shrinking ever since. The company's shares have also dropped by about 25% in the same period, knocking some $11 billion off its value. Other factors that may have factored into the decline include the cost of living crisis, but the boycott is thought to have played a decisive role, with Starbucks Middle Eastern franchising having to cut 2,000 jobs in March due to the action. The global action against Starbucks began when Workers United, that's a union organising Starbucks baristas in the US, tweeted a pro-Palestinian message of solidarity over photos of bulldozers breaking down the Gaza wall on October the 7th. Starbucks then tried to sue the union for copyright infringement for using its name and demanding it delete the tweet, and that triggered a global boycott of the brand. I guess when you're anyone other than Israel, actions do have consequences, obviously. For Israel, they haven't yet. Dalia, I suppose should people be heartened by this?
Yeah, and I think it's very important in these moments of despair to really hold on to these kind of flashes where we can see our own power, because right now, I think that literally the only lever we have to pull is for regular people to use the means at their disposal to make Israel into a pariah state, to show the world that you cannot commit genocide with impunity and go back to and like continue as if nothing has happened. And boycotting, divestment, sanctioning, whether that's you personally, consumer boycotts, or whether it's, organizing so that your workplace divests from particular, technologies or things that are on the boycott list, on the divestment list. These are, and also campaigning for sanctions. These are the kinds of tools that we have at our disposal to basically express public opinion, which is overwhelmingly against this genocide and overwhelmingly in favor of a total arms embargo, at least in Britain, against Israel, to be able to express public opinion when we are in this very urgent and time-sensitive moment where every day that passes that this continues, people are dying in the most horrific way. Society is being attacked. Civil society in Palestine is being attacked. These are one of the few things that we have at our disposal, and it makes me feel so enraged, particularly when I think about how much work the government has put, the Conservative government, especially with their anti-BDS bill, have put into trying to take one of these few leverages of power that ordinary people have, legitimate points of power that ordinary people have, away from them. Let's not forget, it's the Department of Levelling Up. This is the department that is supposed to solve our housing crisis, the department that should be dealing with the fact that homelessness is at an all-time high in our major cities, that should be dealing with the geographic class inequality in this country, and yet spent all this political capital and political time and taxpayer money to try and stop people from being able to conduct BDS campaigns in public bodies. And now we are seeing that they put all that effort into withdrawing a tool that has historically been used to stop human rights abuses and atrocities, and that we can now see is necessary more than ever. I mean, where were the priorities of the Conservative government? And, while the Labour Party did oppose the BDS bill, it wasn't on the grounds that people should be able to campaign for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions of governments that are committing atrocities, but rather it was just because they described the bill as badly drafted, but offered a lot of political support for the spirit of this bill and spread lies about what the BDS campaign want to achieve. And so what I would say is that it is very important, despite the despair and despite the feeling of powerlessness, to recognize that when we can see the shares of a company like Starbucks going down as a clear message that people are exercising whatever power they have to express that they do not want this genocide to continue, and that there will be consequences for companies that are seen to be complicit in this, that this is one of the few powerful tools that we have, and it's really important that we exercise it.
Former British Prime Minister Liz Truss is out and about flogging her memoir. It's called 10 Years to Save the West. It's her manifesto for resuscitating conservatism, a movement which she did quite a lot to destroy, let's face it. For some reason, though, people just don't seem to be taking her seriously. Here's what happened at a speaking event in Suffolk.
Well, I support Trump and I want him to win. What? But and I think it's what I was saying a bit about incumbents. I think the average American is not doing well, and people do vote on. I think it was Bill Clinton's advisor who said it's the economy's stupid. So I think that he will probably win.
On that.
I've got a load of Trump questions, by the way. But what?
No idea where that's come from.
Fox, our producer, just told me don't feel sorry for her, but she did look quite defeated there, didn't she? She was also dressed in the colour of a lettuce. It's quite odd. I don't know how Led by Donkeys, the campaign group, managed to get that there, because it was sort of on stage. I mean, it looked a bit like an inside job, which I suppose maybe was why she looked quite so insulted, because she thought, she'd been invited to give this talk and that they'd humiliated her in front of everyone. Liz Truss has responded to that prank beyond saying this wasn't funny, although she did just repeat that line. What happened last night was not funny. Far-left activists disrupted the event, which then had to be stopped for security reasons. This is done to intimidate people and suppress free speech. I won't stand for it. Would we see the same reaction if the activists were far right? Well, far right activists don't tend to just drop mild-mannered joke banners. They often throw bricks or hurl racist abuse at people. So I'm not quite sure the comparison works. What do you think of this, Dalia? I mean, lots of people commenting that it's not particularly politically relevant to be this is a former prime minister who everyone agrees is shite. So sort of going around and continuing to humiliate her is not a particularly brave political act. But is it a good prank? I mean, it's moderately amusing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that maybe the reason that Led by Donkeys would have seen this as important point is, it's not just that she's, a washed up prime minister, but she is making this very concerted attempt to kind of bolster Trumpism in the Anglosphere, right? That's her new project. It's, this fear mongering about the death of the West and, she's desperately trying to be part of Trump's campaign. I don't think he knows who she is, but she is trying. But so many things had to fall in line so perfectly for that to be as funny as it was. The fact she's wearing the same color as a very lettucey shade of green, but also the fact that she literally said the words, "It's the economy, stupid." And then the banner comes down. They didn't know what she was going to say. That was incredible timing. And no matter how many times she says it's not funny, I'm like, no, it just is funny. You just don't it is. Sorry, girl. I mean, I'm sad. I'm not sad for you, but I get it, but it is funny, objectively.
Yeah. I mean, I think whatever you think of pranks, if you get pranked, probably what you should not do is say that's not funny. You have to be, whatever you think of pranks, you've got to be able to kind of laugh it off. That's not funny, and walking off looking very upset and then tweeting it the following day. Dalia, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks for having me, Michael. The platonic ideal of a Wednesday.
I like that. I'm running with that. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back tomorrow at 6. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.